Have you ever wondered why some invisible threads seem to tie a person's heart to another, pulling, bending, even shaping their choices without a single word spoken? It is not desire alone that ensnares, nor passion in its obvious blaze, but the subtle architecture of unseen control, constructed delicately atop the softest fissures of the psyche, the attachment wounds that have never fully healed. These are the quiet cracks in the soul where fear of abandonment, the shadow of unworthiness, and longing for validation converge, creating a stage upon which the dance of manipulation and surrender plays out, often unnoticed until its rhythms have become habit. She may not even recognize it at first. In the dim corridors of her mind, where memories echo like distant storms, a boy's disregard, a parent's coldness, the subtle absence of affirmation, each has etched a line of vulnerability into her unconscious. These invisible etchings respond to the world as though they were commands, guiding attention, shaping emotion, coaxing compliance. A glance of approval, a smile withheld, or a tone of voice, and the wound flares, setting off a cascade of responses rooted in ancient survival instincts, yet amplified in the modern theater of human desire. The man, whether knowingly or unknowingly, becomes attuned to these fissures. He feels the pull of uncertainty in her gaze, the way hesitation hangs like mist around her choices. And in that mist, he learns to navigate, to exert influence not through overt domination but through subtler, almost invisible currents. This is the essence of unseen control. It is a force that thrives on what remains unspoken, on emotional levers that exist solely because they were left unattended within her own psyche. To recognize it, one must first see the wound, not as blame, not as guilt, but as the fertile soil from which this intricate dance grows. Observe her in these moments as she negotiates her worth through quiet tests of attention. Each pause, each withdrawal, each subtle sigh becomes a mirror reflecting back the echoes of her past. She may call it intuition, instinct, or even misfortune, but in truth it is the echo of a history written into her very nervous system. The invisible threads tug most fiercely where fear has been cemented early. Those who have known abandonment, betrayal, or dismissal carry a sensitivity to control that can be both a gift and a trap. It allows them to perceive nuances others overlook, yet it also creates a field upon which others can operate with almost surgical precision. There is poetry, dark and compelling, in this architecture of the psyche. The wounded feminine, archetypally speaking, is like a river hemmed in by jagged rocks. Every bend, every obstacle carved over years of erosion, channels the water in particular patterns. A shadow may rise, an animus projection may flare, and the river shifts course momentarily, obeying forces both internal and external. She is not powerless, far from it, but her strength is veiled, a latent sovereignty awaiting recognition, awaiting the conscious courage to face the river's full depth without flinching at its turbulence. You, watching this unfold in the mirror of another, might feel a surge of recognition, a sudden awareness that the same unseen control exists within you, or has existed, guiding choices like whispers in a hall of shadows. There is no shame in this. Carl Jung taught that the unacknowledged shadow grows, waits, and manipulates from beneath the threshold of awareness. When these attachment wounds are ignored, the psyche compensates through projection, seeking validation, asserting control through subtle means that can feel as involuntary as breathing. The same unconscious mechanisms that have bound her to others now whisper to her own heart, urging repetition, caution, and sometimes compromise. And yet, in these very fissures lies the path to liberation. The wound that enables unseen control is also the doorway to awareness, a key to self-mastery that glows when she leans into reflection. She may keep a journal, not as a checklist of grievances, but as a sacred space where each thought and emotional tremor is traced with reverence, each line a mapping of her interior world. Here, she confronts the projections, the echoes of past neglect, the phantom commands embedded in her attachment patterns. Slowly, she begins to recognize the signals that once bound her, the small pangs of doubt, the obsessive curiosity about another's approval, the invisible levers she had unconsciously offered. Through this recognition, she gains power not by controlling others but by reclaiming herself. She learns the art of emotional sovereignty, observing desire without being consumed, noting fear without capitulation, and honoring need without surrendering autonomy. The man, the other, the external agent of control. They remain actors upon the stage, but she becomes the playwright, the director, and the audience simultaneously. It is a reclamation of her inner kingdom, a quiet yet formidable assertion that, while the wound shaped her patterns, it does not have to dictate her destiny. Imagine her standing at the edge of her own consciousness, where the waters of the past lap insistently at her feet, each wave a memory, a longing, a fear she once believed uncontrollable. Here, the unseen control, once external, now mirrored within, looms large, not as a tyrant but as a shadowed teacher. She senses the subtle sway of her attachment patterns, the anxious flutter when attention falters, the compulsive appeasement when approval seems distant, the quiet self-erasure to maintain proximity. These are not flaws. They are echoes of survival strategies etched into the psyche long before the present moment arrived. And in acknowledging them, she begins to perceive the rhythm of her own influence, the invisible currents that have guided not only her relationships but her perception of self-worth. Each encounter becomes a mirror, reflecting both vulnerability and resilience. A partner's mood, a friend's comment, a lover's glance, each strikes the wound, yet also illuminates its contours. The depth of her sensitivity, once a source of fear, transforms into a prism through which she can refract reality, discerning subtle motives, unspoken desires, and the hidden architecture of emotional exchange. She understands, almost instinctively, that those who would exert unseen control do not rely solely on charm or coercion. They seek the fissures, the unhealed places, where influence is effortless. And now, she recognizes these openings not with shame, but with the curiosity of a sovereign surveying her domain. There is power in this recognition, a quiet, steady force that does not shout but commands. Jungian shadow work reveals that every projection, every external manipulation, is an invitation to reclaim what has been disowned within herself. She sees her own anxieties reflected in the manipulator's maneuvers, her own fears given form in the external pressure. In this dance of reflection, the roles of victim and puppet begin to dissolve. She begins to embody the archetype of the sovereign feminine, unyielding, perceptive, and self-aware, aware that true mastery arises not from domination over another, but from mastery over one's own inner landscape. The wound that once allowed unseen control to flourish now becomes a lodestar. She discovers that when she observes her responses without judgment, when she traces the lineage of her attachment patterns back through memory, she is no longer simply reacting. She is initiating, shaping, and redefining the emotional terrain. The anxious flutter becomes a signal, not a shackle. The compulsion to appease becomes a choice, not a mandate. The longing for validation becomes a compass pointing towards self-recognition. In these moments, she touches the essence of individuation, the process by which the psyche becomes whole, integrating shadow and light, desire and discernment, need and autonomy. Her relationships, once fields of subtle entrapment, begin to shift. The men who sensed and exploited her fissures may now find themselves navigating a landscape they cannot control, encountering boundaries that are alive, fluid, yet immovable in their clarity. She does not strike out with anger or revenge, but she radiates a presence that is impervious to manipulation. The unseen levers, once the source of tension and compliance, lie dormant because the psyche that fueled them has become conscious, integrated, and sovereign. She has become the alchemist of her own interior world, transforming vulnerability into wisdom, wound into agency, longing into discernment. There is also a cinematic quality to this transformation, a poetic rhythm that courses through her daily existence. The morning sunlight spills across the floor, illuminating the pages of a journal filled with reflections and revelations. A cup of tea steams quietly in her hand, yet in this stillness, the echoes of the past are heard, acknowledged, and released. In conversation, she listens not to respond but to witness, not to placate but to perceive. Each interaction carries the weight of awareness, the subtle authority of someone who knows that her inner alignment cannot be swayed by external forces. And still, the shadow is not vanquished. It cannot be. Jungian thought teaches that the shadow is eternal, a necessary companion on the path of growth. But now, the shadow is known, engaged with consciously, and respected for the depth it brings. The wounded places are no longer exploited. They are tended, honored, and integrated into a larger vision of selfhood. The woman who was once unconsciously led by her own attachment wounds now leads herself through a terrain both treacherous and luminous, where every encounter offers insight, every reflection sharpens discernment, and every choice reinforces sovereignty. In this new realm, desire no longer carries the weight of fear. She experiences attraction and intimacy not as arenas for validation, but as expressions of mutual resonance. The men she encounters may still seek to influence, still attempt subtle control, but their efforts meet a consciousness that is awake, embodied, and unyielding. Her attachment wounds, once the fertile soil of unseen control, now serve as archives of wisdom, guiding her toward partners who recognize and honor her wholeness. Most women do not see it at first, the quiet choreography of influence that winds through the spaces between heartbeats. It moves in whispers, a glance lingering too long, a hesitation that sparks anxiety, a withdrawal that compels pursuit. The wound, the tender fissure left by absent affirmation, gives life to these invisible forces. It is in these subtle openings that control survives, unspoken and often unrecognized, feeding on the unconscious need for validation, acceptance, and love. Yet she, the one who observes herself with unflinching honesty, begins to notice. She begins to trace the lines of her own susceptibility, mapping the shadow patterns that once dictated her emotional responses like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. The realization is almost cinematic in its gravity. She recalls the quiet evenings spent replaying conversations, the way her heart raced when someone's attention shifted, the inexplicable compulsion to align her desires with another's whims. Each memory is a brushstroke painting, a portrait of vulnerability, a topography of the soul that has been navigated unknowingly. The recognition of this pattern does not weaken her. It illuminates the very mechanics of unseen control, revealing the tendrils that once bound her. With awareness comes choice. With recognition comes sovereignty. Her journey toward mastery is neither linear nor gentle. It demands confrontation with the deepest shadows. The child within who feared abandonment, the adolescent who sought approval, the adult whose self-worth trembled in proximity to desire. Each shadow, once a hidden architect of compliance, is now engaged consciously. The integration of these fragmented selves is a delicate alchemy, transforming fear into discernment, anxiety into insight, longing into self-possession. The wound that allowed unseen control to flourish becomes the very portal through which she accesses power. The authority to respond rather than react, to observe rather than collapse, to choose rather than surrender. In the interplay of relationships, the transformation is palpable. The subtle levers of influence, the invisible strings once pulled by others, meet a psyche that no longer yields unconsciously. Her presence is luminous with awareness, a force both gentle and unassailable. She does not need to dominate, manipulate, or demand. She simply embodies clarity, an emotional gravity that compels respect without assertion. The man who might have sensed and exploited her fissures now encounters boundaries that exist not as walls, but as extensions of conscious selfhood, flowing naturally from her inner equilibrium. There is an artistry to this sovereignty. She keeps a small notebook where she traces the patterns of emotional exchange, not as judgment but as insight, as a living map of her psyche's response to the world. Each entry becomes a meditation, a symbolic dialogue between her conscious self and the echoes of past wounds. Here, she witnesses the subtle mechanics of influence, how fear, desire, and longing intertwine, and disentangles herself from their unconscious grip. She begins to see that unseen control thrives only where the psyche remains fragmented, where attachment wounds remain unhealed, where consciousness is asleep. Awakening dissolves its power. Her life transforms in ways both subtle and profound. In conversations, she listens without attachment, perceives without compulsion, and responds with sovereign discernment. Her emotional field, once porous, now contains clarity and boundaries that are alive rather than rigid. She learns to inhabit her desires fully, to feel without fear, to attract without surrendering autonomy. The unseen forces that once directed her actions now exist as reflections, not commands. She moves through the world with an elegance born of self-possession, her presence commanding attention not through manipulation, but through resonance, authenticity, and the quiet authority of an integrated psyche. Yet the journey is also steeped in poetic tension. The wounded feminine within her is not eradicated. It is embraced, understood, and transformed. She dances with her shadow, dialogues with her anima and animus, and confronts the deep currents of longing and fear that have guided her for decades. In these inner confrontations, she finds a new rhythm, the heartbeat of self-sovereignty, the cadence of emotional freedom, the silent music of desire aligned with discernment. She understands that the same attachment wounds that allowed Contro L to persist are also the wells of wisdom from which resilience and insight emerge. Her encounters with others become mirrors, yet no longer prisons. Each interaction reveals a new facet of herself, a layer of consciousness that can now be held without fear. The man who attempts subtle control, the friend who tests loyalty, the lover who vacillates between warmth and withdrawal, all become instruments through which she practices mastery over her inner world. She perceives projection without reaction, influence without capitulation, desire without compromise. Her psyche, once fertile ground for unseen control, now thrives in conscious sovereignty, radiating a force that is as invisible as it is undeniable. In this luminous state, she inhabits a landscape both dangerous and transcendent. The emotional currents that once swept her along without consent now ripple gently under her observation. The shadows are present but recognized, the fissures visible but integrated, the patterns familiar but no longer binding. Her attachment wounds, once exploited by external forces, now serve as teachers, guiding her toward authenticity, empowerment, and a presence that cannot be unconsciously swayed. She has become a master of her own inner theater, orchestrating the play of desire, control, and emotional resonance with both subtlety and clarity. Some women spend years wandering through the fog of their own attachments, feeling the tug of invisible hands they cannot see, unaware that these forces are born not entirely outside themselves, but within. The echo of unhealed longing, the residue of absence, the quiet insistence of a wounded heart seeking validation. She, however, begins to perceive the architecture of her own interior landscape, tracing the currents that once dictated her choices. The realization comes like a shutter opening. Every anxious text, every compulsive pursuit, every moment of self-erasure was never purely about the other. It was about her wound, the space where love, once withheld or inconsistent, carved an ache so precise it could be manipulated without effort. She sees, too, that the man who would subtly control her is often an unwitting mirror of her own psyche. His words and actions resonate with the echoes of her fears. His silences reflect the gaps of her own past. In this recognition lies a quiet, almost unbearable power, the ability to respond not as she once did, but as a sovereign, aware and unshakable. The psychology of desire, once a labyrinth of uncertainty and compulsion, becomes a terrain she navigates with discernment. The attachment wound, which once nourished unseen control, is now an instrument of awakening, teaching her the boundaries of intimacy, the architecture of influence, and the sovereignty of her own attention. There is a cinematic quality to her transformation. The world, once a stage for subtle coercion and emotional manipulation, becomes a theater in which she commands the frame without speaking a word. A partner's flirtation, a colleague's pressure, a lover's withdrawal, these gestures, once triggers of anxiety and compliance, are now observed as phenomena, reflections of her own patterns, cues for conscious engagement, and tests of her emerging autonomy. The unseen threads that once dictated her behavior unravel in the light of awareness, leaving her free to move with intention, grace, and the quiet authority of self-possession. Her inner dialogue deepens, shaded with the wisdom of Stoic thought. She recalls Marcus Aurelius, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." Each moment of anxiety, each flicker of fear or desire is met with measured attention. The attachment wound is acknowledged, honored, and then translated into insight rather than reaction. She discovers that unseen control thrives on unconscious submission, and in waking consciousness, its power dissolves. The wound no longer dictates the dance, she does. She becomes the orchestrator of her own responses, the sovereign of her emotional terrain, the arbiter of her attention. And yet there is poetry in the tension, in the shadow interplay. She feels the pull of old patterns, the instinct to seek approval, the habit of overcompensation. But now she observes these urges as one might watch a storm from a mountaintop, acknowledging its force, understanding its path but not surrendering to it. In this observation lies freedom, the freedom to desire without dependence, to respond without compulsion, to connect without compromise. She begins to recognize the archetypal dynamics at play, the wounded feminine, the projected animus, the shadow desires of both self and other, allowing her to navigate relationships not as a victim of subtle control, but as a conscious participant in the interplay of hearts and minds. Her presence becomes magnetic in its authenticity. Men who attempt subtle manipulation sense the shift immediately. The unconscious levers they once relied upon no longer respond in predictable ways. They encounter clarity, boundaries, and self-possession. The woman who was once guided by unseen control now guides herself, radiating a confidence that is both fierce and inviting. She understands that power is not the imposition of will over another, but the mastery of self, the capacity to perceive influence without succumbing, to love without losing sovereignty. Even in solitude, she feels the transformation. Moments of stillness, reflection, and shadow work deepen her understanding of self and others. The journal she keeps, once a repository of fears and anxieties, is now a map of consciousness, charting the territory of desire, attachment, and autonomy. The wound, once a source of subtle manipulation, becomes a teacher, showing her where she has been and illuminating the path to where she is meant to go. The emotional currents of her life, once turbulent and uncertain, now flow with intention and clarity. Each interaction is a study in resonance and reflection, each challenge an opportunity for conscious engagement, each desire a mirror for self-awareness. She has learned to navigate the unseen with grace, to perceive the architecture of influence, and to honor the attachment wounds that shaped her without allowing them to control her. In this luminous state, she inhabits both the shadow and the light, the wound and the wisdom, the desire and the discernment, fully and without compromise. Do you know how many women move through life carrying invisible chains, forged not by others, cruelty, but by the tender fractures of their own hearts? The attachment wound, that delicate, often unspoken fissure, is both prison and lantern, feeding the subtle manipulations of unseen control while also illuminating the path to sovereignty. She begins to sense the contours of this unseen architecture, noticing how her own fears, desires, and compulsions have choreographed dances she believed were spontaneous, authentic, or fated. It is a moment both terrifying and electrifying, to see the ways her psyche has been a co-author of her own entanglement, to recognize that the threads she thought were external are intertwined with her internal patterns. In this awakening, she discovers a strange alchemy. Every flicker of anxiety that once signaled dependence, every pang of longing that once whispered compliance, becomes a signal, a guidepost to awareness. She learns to read the shadows, the subtle shifts in tone, the fleeting expressions, the pauses that once compelled pursuit or surrender. These signals, once the instruments of unseen control wielded by others, now serve as mirrors reflecting her own inner terrain. The recognition of this mirror allows her to respond not through habitual reaction, but through conscious choice, an assertion of autonomy that radiates as quiet but undeniable authority. The man who once sensed and exploited her fissures now confronts a presence that cannot be unconsciously swayed. The subtle levers of control, the withdrawals, the provocations, the silent tests, find no purchase. She moves in the relational field with precision, intuition, and grounded presence, no longer compelled to submit to the invisible architecture of influence that once guided her. In this new dynamic, desire becomes a dialogue, not a battlefield. Intimacy becomes a meeting of wholeness, not an arena of projection. She perceives the interplay of shadow and anima, of ego projection and hidden longing, navigating each encounter with both sensitivity and sovereignty. Her interior world, once a landscape of quiet compromise and hidden fear, transforms into a realm of conscious engagement. Journals and reflections chart her patterns without judgment, revealing the intricate dance of attachment, desire, and response. Each memory of longing or compliance is recognized as a lesson, each reaction traced back to its origin in the early fissures of her psyche. Here, she encounters the full force of Jungian insight. The shadow is not enemy but guide, the anima not obstacle but teacher, and the unhealed wound not a limitation but a doorway to mastery. There is a cinematic intensity to this evolution. The morning light streams across her space, illuminating the pages of her reflections, casting shadows that move with a quiet grace. She feels the resonance of her own presence ripple through the world, silent, profound, magnetic. Men, lovers, colleagues, and strangers all encounter a force that cannot be compelled, a clarity that cannot be manipulated. Where fear once guided behavior, discernment now moves freely. Where longing once demanded compliance, choice now prevails. The subtle orchestration of unseen control has dissolved, replaced by the sovereign rhythm of conscious agency. And yet, the transformation is neither simple nor serene. She continues to encounter her own shadows, those whispering echoes of attachment wounds, the subtle stirrings of fear or desire that arise with invitation. But now she engages them directly, naming, witnessing, and integrating each fragment of self. She experiences the full spectrum of emotional resonance, the ache of longing, the pulse of desire, the sting of rejection, without succumbing to unconscious influence. She is awake in a world that often moves like a tide beneath sleepwalking hearts, perceiving currents that others navigate blindly, yet choosing her path with deliberate clarity. The paradox of sovereignty is profound. The very wounds that once allowed her to be unconsciously guided now offer the deepest wells of insight. Every pattern, every vulnerability, every subtle susceptibility becomes a tool for understanding, a key to emotional mastery, a guide to authentic presence. She sees the threads of influence that run through relationships and understands that they are only effective where consciousness is absent. Her awareness, like a lantern in a darkened room, illuminates the mechanisms of unseen control, rendering them inert. She no longer dances to invisible rhythms. She composes her own music, both fierce and elegant, intimate and expansive. In this space, attraction, intimacy, and desire are no longer arenas of subtle warfare. They are mirrors, canvases, and instruments for reflection, learning, and mutual resonance. She experiences the interplay of shadow and projection not as threat, but as opportunity. She witnesses desire without being compelled, recognizes influence without surrendering, and cultivates relationships not through manipulation, but through conscious alignment and authentic resonance. The unseen control that once shaped her world now exists as an echo, a teacher, and a testament to the sovereignty she has claimed. If a man attempts to wield subtle control now, he finds only presence where he expected pliancy, clarity where he expected uncertainty, and boundaries that are alive, fluid, yet unyielding. She moves through these encounters not with anger or retaliation, but with the quiet authority of someone who has met her own shadows and emerged whole. The attachment wounds that once dictated her emotional responses are no longer scripts she follows unconsciously. They are archives of insight, guides illuminating where desire and fear once collided. In this awareness, she discovers a profound freedom, the freedom to engage without surrender, to feel without compromise, to be both luminous and impenetrable. Her relationships evolve into a landscape of resonance rather than conquest. Men may still attempt subtle levers of influence, yet she navigates them as a conductor navigates an orchestra, with intuition, precision, and an unwavering awareness of her own emotional rhythms. The pull of approval, the ache of longing, the compulsion to appease, all are acknowledged, observed, and transformed into choice. She recognizes that control, when unconscious, is a form of survival, but when brought into consciousness, it becomes a tool for understanding, self-mastery, and the cultivation of authentic intimacy. There is a ritualistic poetry to her sovereignty. She may sit by a window as the evening light folds into shadows, tracing the movements of her own emotional currents. Each reflection, each note in a journal, is a meditation, a dialogue with the fragments of herself she once ignored. She witnesses the subtle mechanics of influence, the ways her attachment patterns shape perception, the moments fear and desire orchestrated compliance, the instances her inner child sought validation at the cost of autonomy. In observing these forces, she neither judges nor suppresses. She integrates. The shadow, once a manipulator of unconscious behavior, becomes an ally in the choreography of consciousness. The cinematic quality of her existence intensifies as her inner mastery manifests externally. Conversations, once arenas for subtle power plays, become spaces for observation, clarity, and measured response. The invisible currents that once guided her behavior are now visible, navigable, and ultimately subject to her sovereign choice. She perceives projection without reaction, influence without surrender, desire without entrapment. The men who encounter her feel a shift, subtle yet undeniable, a presence that cannot be unconsciously swayed, a mind and heart aligned in harmonious sovereignty. Her awareness extends beyond relationships into every facet of life. Attachment wounds, once the conduits for unseen control, serve as maps of psychological and emotional intelligence. She traces patterns not to critique, but to understand, not to constrain, but to liberate. She navigates the social world with the elegance of someone who recognizes the choreography of influence and chooses her steps with precision. The pull of old fears may arise, but they meet the resilience of an integrated self, the clarity of a conscious mind, and the authority of a heart that has reclaimed its own narrative. Even in solitude, she is fully awake, the Qui. At moments are rich with insight. The shadows of longing, the echoes of early absence, the tremors of desire, they are all acknowledged, felt, and woven into the tapestry of self-mastery. Her journal, her reflections, her meditations, all serve as instruments of discernment, revealing the subtle ways unseen control sought to guide her, and the deliberate ways she now shapes her own emotional landscape. She experiences intimacy with herself fully, a precursor to authentic resonance with others. The transformation carries an almost mythic quality. She embodies the sovereign feminine archetype, aware, unflinching, radiant in her presence. Desire no longer compels, it communicates. Influence no longer dictates, it informs. The unseen control that once shaped her world becomes a shadow she can engage, study, and transcend. The attachment wounds, once exploited by others, now empower her with insight, resilience, and the authority to choose how she responds, when she engages, and with whom she aligns her heart and attention. And in this luminous, sovereign state, she feels the quiet power of emotional freedom. Every past fracture, every early absence, every subtle manipulation is honored as a teacher. Every shadow and every longing is recognized as a guide. She moves through the world with clarity, grace, and the magnetic authority of one who has reclaimed her own psyche. Desire, intimacy, and attraction are no longer arenas for unconscious surrender, but reflections of her alignment, resonance, and the conscious dance of hearts. Today, perhaps more than ever, she understands that freedom is not given, it is claimed. The threads of unseen control, woven for decades through attachment wounds, now lie inert beneath her conscious gaze. She has walked through the fire of longing, betrayal, and subtle manipulation, and emerged not hardened but refined, like gold purified in flame. Each wound that once whispered demands for validation has been transformed into a lantern, illuminating the inner landscape of desire, fear, and sovereignty. The psyche that was once a conduit for unconscious compliance now pulses with conscious authority, a force both tender and unassailable. She inhabits her presence like a sovereign inhabits a kingdom, aware of every gesture, every impulse, every subtle tug from the world around her. Men, lovers, colleagues, even friends, encounter a woman whose inner gravity cannot be shifted by manipulation, whose boundaries are both flexible and firm, whose desires are acknowledged without compulsion. She understands that influence survives only in the absence of awareness. Consciousness renders it powerless. And so she moves through life with both vigilance and grace. Her awareness, an invisible shield that transforms encounters from fields of control into arenas of authentic resonance. The poetic tension of her journey is palpable. Shadows arise as they always will, whispering of fear, longing, and past abandonment. Yet she engages them with elegance, observing each tremor of the heart as one might watch wind ripple across water, acknowledging the movement, understanding its origin, yet refusing to be swept away. Her attachment wounds, once exploited by the unconscious currents of unseen control, now serve as instruments of insight, mapping the pathways of desire, projection, and emotional resonance. Each reflection is a step toward mastery, each moment of awareness a declaration of sovereignty. Her inner world becomes a theater of conscious orchestration. Desire is no longer a battlefield, it is a dialogue. Influence is no longer coercion, it is information. She recognizes projection in herself and others, perceives the subtle rhythms of emotional manipulation, and responds with clarity and intention. The men who once sensed her fissures now encounter presence and authority. The forces that once guided her unconsciously now serve as mirrors of her own evolution. She understands that true power is not in control over another, but mastery over self, the ability to move, feel, and respond without surrendering sovereignty. There is a stoic resonance in her practice. She meets each impulse with measured attention, each fear with conscious discernment. Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Seneca, these voices echo through her inner dialogue, reminding her that the events of life are not what disturb her, but the unexamined responses to them. The pull of attachment, the ache of desire, the compulsion for approval, each is a teacher, a signal, an invitation to integrate shadow and light. She perceives influence without submission, recognizes manipulation without resistance, and embraces desire without dependency. Her presence, once shaped by unseen control, now radiates conscious authority. Conversations that once triggered anxious compliance now unfold as opportunities for observation and measured response. Every subtle lever that might have once shifted her behavior is rendered inert by awareness, by sovereignty, by the conscious claim of her own psyche. She moves through relational spaces as both participant and observer, both sovereign and lover, embodying a rare balance of intuition, discernment, and magnetic presence. Even solitude becomes sacred, a laboratory for the integration of shadow and light. The quiet moments, the reflective journaling, the meditations upon desire and attachment, they are all instruments of inner mastery. She traces the lines of her own unconscious responses, observes the subtle echoes of early wounds, and translates them into conscious choice. Each interaction becomes a rehearsal for sovereignty, each reflection a refinement of presence, each awareness a deepening of alignment. And in this alchemy of self-awareness, she discovers that the very wounds which once allowed unseen control to flourish are now her greatest guides. The anxious patterns, the longing for validation, the early experiences of absence, they are transformed into tools of discernment, instruments of insight and catalysts of empowerment. Her psyche, once fertile ground for subtle manipulation, now thrives in conscious sovereignty, radiating a quiet power that cannot be commandeered, seduced, or coerced. The transformation is complete not in the absence of desire or shadow, but in the mastery of their currents. She moves with clarity through attraction, intimacy, and emotional resonance. She witnesses projection without being consumed, influence without being manipulated, and longing without surrendering autonomy. Each moment of awareness reinforces sovereignty, each reflection deepens mastery, and each interaction becomes a testament to the power of conscious presence. She feels the pulse of her own autonomy like a drumbeat beneath the surface of every interaction. The invisible threads that once tethered her to another's whims now serve as reminders of how far she has come. She recognizes the architecture of influence, the subtle withdrawals, the unspoken expectations, the conditional affirmations, and she observes them without fear, without haste, without reaction. These forces, once capable of bending her will, now pass through her awareness like wind through an open chamber, felt, acknowledged, and ultimately harmless. Her attachment wounds, once the conduits of unseen control, have become instruments of insight, allowing her to navigate desire, intimacy, and connection with conscious sovereignty. There is a cinematic cadence to her life, as if each moment unfolds like a carefully framed scene in a film of psychological awakening. The morning sun glances off her reflection in the mirror, catching the glint of clarity in her eyes. Every interaction, be it a fleeting encounter or a prolonged exchange, is observed with the poise of someone who knows her own interior rhythms. She no longer reacts with compulsive urgency. She moves with deliberate grace. The subtle cues that once elicited anxiety or submission are now recognized, integrated, and transformed into conscious choice. In her presence, influence finds no purchase. Desire encounters resonance, not leverage. Her relationships are no longer stages of manipulation, but arenas of mutual reflection. The men who once detected her fissures now face a psyche that cannot be unconsciously swayed. She perceives projection in both herself and others, distinguishing between shadows cast by unhealed wounds and the reality of the present moment. Each interaction becomes a dialogue rather than a drama, a space for authenticity rather than subtle conquest. She understands that the invisible architecture of control exists only where consciousness is asleep. Where awareness reigns, influence loses its potency, and attachment wounds, though present, become instruments of wisdom rather than tools of compliance. There is a stoic elegance in her sovereignty. Each flutter of desire, each pang of longing, each echo of fear is met with deliberate observation. The pull of attachment no longer commands her, it communicates. She feels without being consumed, desires without being compelled, and engages without surrender. Marcus Aurelius, wisdom reverberates through her consciousness. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. In this awareness, unseen control is not merely neutralized. It is transmuted into insight, an opportunity to master both self and circumstance. The shadows within her, long ignored, are now companions on her journey. She dialogues with them, observes them, and integrates them. Each reflection, each journal entry, each moment of mindful attention becomes a bridge between the wounded child she once was and the sovereign woman she has become. She sees that the very vulnerabilities that once enabled unseen control are now portals to autonomy, empathy, and emotional intelligence. She moves through the world with the quiet magnetism of someone who has reconciled longing with discernment, desire with independence, and shadow with light. Even moments of solitude are imbued with power. She cultivates an internal landscape rich with insight, mapping the echoes of past attachment patterns while observing the currents of present desire. Each meditation, each note, each reflection is a rehearsal in sovereignty. She feels the subtle pull of old patterns but meets them with presence, understanding, and clarity. The psyche that once bent under unseen influence now flows with conscious authority, radiating a presence that is both tender and unassailable. Her transformation extends beyond relationships into every dimension of her life. Decisions are guided by alignment rather than compulsion. Perception is sharpened by insight, and action is infused with intentionality. She engages the world not from a place of fear or longing, but from the magnetic center of her own integrated consciousness. Unseen control, once a persistent shadow, now exists only as a memory, a teacher, a reminder of the power that comes from self-awareness and emotional mastery. And in this luminous state, she moves freely through desire, attraction, and intimacy. She witnesses without being bound, experiences without being constrained, and chooses without being coerced. Her attachment wounds, once the soil for manipulation, now serve as seeds of wisdom. The The currents that once dictated her choices now flow according to her conscious direction, resonating with her sovereignty, her clarity, and her unyielding presence. Somewhere in the quiet spaces of her being, she feels the profound shift that comes from reclaiming what was once given over to unseen forces. The subtle, almost imperceptible levers of control that shaped her actions, guided her desires, and dictated her emotional responses are now merely shadows, echoes of patterns she has illuminated, understood, and transcended. The attachment wounds that once fed these currents are no longer vulnerabilities to be exploited. They are instruments of insight, revealing the delicate architecture of her own psyche and the hidden mechanics of human influence. She moves through the world with the elegance of one who has mastered the alchemy of self-awareness. Each interaction, whether fleeting or intimate, is met with a presence that is simultaneously soft and resolute, radiant and unassailable. Men who once sensed her fissures now encounter a consciousness that cannot be swayed by subtle manipulation, a mind that discerns projection without reaction, and a heart that feels without surrendering sovereignty. The power she embodies is not aggression, it is awareness. It is a quiet, magnetic authority that emanates from integration, insight, and the conscious engagement with both shadow and desire. Her emotional life is now a landscape she navigates with intention. The anxious pull of attachment no longer dictates her movement. The compulsion to seek approval no longer guides her decisions. The ache of longing no longer coerces her into compliance. Each impulse is acknowledged, each desire observed, each reflection honored. She has transformed vulnerability into discernment, fear into clarity, and longing into conscious resonance. The currents that once directed her unconsciously now flow in harmony with her inner sovereignty. And in this alignment, unseen control loses its power entirely. There is a cinematic quality to her existence, as if life itself has become a stage on which consciousness and desire dance in deliberate choreography. Morning sunlight falls across her reflections in the journal, illuminating the maps of her psyche, the pathways of past wounds, and the patterns of unseen influence she has now mastered. In each moment, she perceives with precision the subtle tensions, the projections, the emotional rhythms that once shaped her responses without awareness. Yet she meets them not with fear, but with curiosity, clarity, and the quiet authority of one who has reclaimed her own narrative. Her sovereignty extends into every interaction. Conversations that once triggered anxiety and compliance now unfold as opportunities for observation, reflection, and conscious engagement. The men who attempt subtle influence discover that their usual levers find no purchase. She navigates relational dynamics with both empathy and authority, recognizing projection in herself and others, responding without compulsion, and engaging without surrender. Desire and attraction become mirrors of resonance rather than instruments of manipulation. And intimacy transforms into a meeting of whole selves rather than a stage for covert control. Even in solitude, she is fully present. The quiet spaces of her life become laboratories for reflection, shadow integration, and self-mastery. She traces the currents of past attachment patterns, observes the impulses that arise, and integrates them into a conscious understanding of herself. The moments of stillness are rich with insight, allowing her to discern subtle emotional mechanisms. Refine her internal architecture and deepen her awareness of both self and others. The wounds that once allowed control to flourish are now her guides, illuminating the pathways to authenticity, empowerment, and emotional sovereignty. She embodies the archetype of the sovereign feminine in her full depth, aware, radiant, and unyielding. The shadows that once shaped her choices are embraced as teachers. The currents that once dictated her behavior are now channels of insight, and the attachment wounds that once bound her are now instruments of mastery. She moves through desire, attraction, and emotional engagement with clarity, grace, and conscious authority, perceiving influence without capitulating, feeling without losing sovereignty, and engaging without compromise. And in this luminous state, she reaches the apex of her transformation. The unseen control that once shaped her world is no longer operative. The attachment wounds that once guided her choices are now sources of wisdom. She is awake in a world that often moves blindly, anchored in her own consciousness, her own power, and her own integrity. She has transcended the subtle manipulations of both self and others, claiming the freedom, clarity, and sovereignty that come from conscious awareness. She carries herself with the quiet magnetism of someone who has reclaimed every fragment of her psyche. The subtle manipulations that once orchestrated her desires now ripple harmlessly across the surface of her awareness, leaving her unshaken, untethered, and radiant. Attachment wounds, once fertile ground for unseen control, have become the very instruments that guide her. Maps of longing transformed into compasses of discernment, echoes of fear transmuted into insight, tremors of past dependence reshaped into the rhythm of sovereignty. Each step she takes resonates with a power that is felt but not forced, observed but not imposed, present yet unattached. In the theater of relationships, she is no longer a passive participant. The men who once drew upon her vulnerabilities now confront a presence that cannot be unconsciously swayed. Their words, glances, and silences, once triggers of anxious compliance, now meet her conscious awareness, a field she inhabits fully, observing patterns without being ensnared by them. She recognizes projection without reacting, influence without yielding, desire without compromising. The unseen architecture of control exists now only as a reflection, a tool for understanding, a reminder of the sovereignty she has claimed. There is a poetic rhythm to her transformation, an emotional cadence that resonates deeply within and without. She awakens to the morning light with a pulse that echoes self-possession. Journals of reflection, notes scrawled with the awareness of her own patterns, lie open on her desk. Each page whispers of past wounds, of the subtle levers that once guided her behavior, and of the conscious clarity that now governs her responses. She does not seek to erase the past, nor does she yearn for validation from others. She integrates, observes, and transcends. Her attachment wounds, once exploited, now serve as teachers of depth, discernment, and self-mastery. Even the quiet moments of solitude carry a luminous weight. In these spaces, she dialogues with her shadows, tracing the contours of her own longing, fear, and desire. She witnesses the currents that once moved her unconsciously, recognizes their origins, and transforms them into conscious choice. Desire becomes a mirror, projection a message, influence a reflection, all of which she navigates with sovereign authority. The psyche that was once a conduit for unseen control now thrives in conscious awareness, radiating a presence that is magnetic yet unassailable. Her freedom manifests in subtle but profound ways. Decisions are guided by alignment rather than compulsion, perception sharpened by insight, and action infused with intentionality. She moves through life fully awake, noticing patterns that others miss, perceiving currents that others navigate blindly, and choosing responses that honor her integrity. The invisible threads that once tethered her to the emotional demands of others lie dormant, their power dissolved by awareness. Her attachment wounds, once sources of vulnerability, now illuminate the pathways to authentic connection, emotional mastery, and personal sovereignty. Even as she engages in desire and intimacy, the transformation is complete. She experiences attraction not as submission, but as resonance, intimacy not as compromise, but as meeting of wholeness, desire not as dependence, but as reflection. The men who encounter her recognize, consciously or unconsciously, that she is awake, embodied, and sovereign. Subtle control, which once thrived on unhealed wounds and unconscious responses, now encounters only clarity, presence, and integration. The play of shadows and longing continues, but she moves through it with grace, ise, and a quiet authority that cannot be manipulated or undermined. And in this state, she finally touches the apex of emotional freedom. The currents of unseen influence have no dominion over her. The attachment wounds that once dictated her choices now illuminate the map of her mastery. Her presence is a beacon of conscious power, her attention a compass of clarity, her heart a space of discernment. She has become the embodiment of the sovereign feminine, aware, unyielding, radiant, and free. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase, she chooses.